Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society.
Hi, I'm your host, Dawn Carnegas, and joining me on today's podcast is the man behind the curtain, Dr. Ken Ford, IHMC's CEO Emeritus and Chairman of the Double Secret Selection Committee that selects all the guests who appear on STEM Talk.
Hi, Don. Good to be here.
So today we have another Ask Me Anything episode where we answer listener questions, and our listeners are a very smart and curious bunch, and they submitted a number of wonderful questions on topics that range from ketamine to icebreakers to rapamycin several times to AI to astronaut training and much more. So buckle up for another episode of Ask Me Anything.
Before we jump into our Ask Me Anything episode, we have a little bit of housekeeping. First, a big thank you to everyone who has subscribed to STEM Talk, and an extra thanks to all of you who've left those wonderful 5-star reviews. If you're new to the show and you like what you hear, please consider subscribing. And if you enjoy today's episode, we'd love for you to take a moment to rate the show and maybe even give us a review. It really helps us reach more people who might enjoy STEM Talk.
As always, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been hard at work, scouring iTunes and other podcast apps for the sharpest, funniest, and most lavishly praise-filled reviews to share on STEM Talk. If yours makes the cut and you hear it on the show, send us a note at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your very own official STEM Talk t-shirt. Proof that the committee does, in fact, exist.
Today, our winning review comes from a listener who goes by the moniker Engineer in Massachusetts. The review is titled Super Learning. The review reads, one of the best science and nutrition podcasts in the universe. Ken and Dawn dig deep into what makes the scientists interviewed tick, what they like to study, and why. It has changed the way I think about what goes on in my body. The interview with Dr. Koldorf breaks new ground in a logical discussion of COVID anti-science and what is real. I'm glad you could bring the exposure and credibility to the Brownstone Institute doctors.
Thank you so much, Engineer in Massachusetts, and thanks to all of our other STEM Talk listeners who've helped STEM Talk become such a great success.
Okay, and now on to today's Ask Me Anything questions.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Hi, welcome to STEM Talk. I'm your host, Dawn Carnegas, and joining me today is Ken Ford.
Hello, Don. Good to be here.
And this is another episode of Ask Me Anything, so I think we're going to get started with a question that was actually targeted for me.
Yes, indeed. Here is the question we received for Dawn. It goes like this. Scuba diving would seem to have little in common with zero gravity, which is what astronauts experience in space. So, I've always been confused about why astronauts here on Earth would train for spacewalks in underwater conditions. I recently read an article about NASA's Neutral Buoyancy Lab in Houston, which must be huge because it contains a full-size replica of the International Space Station. What do you know about the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, and could you go into more detail about why astronauts train underwater when it doesn't recreate a zero-gravity space environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And just to say yes, it is a massive facility. And if you ever get the chance to visit it, I highly recommend visiting the facility. It's incredible to walk in and see this massive pool with essentially the space station underwater. So just a little bit of background for our listeners. The Neutral Buoyancy Lab in Houston is an indoor pool, and it holds about 6.2 million gallons of water. It's over 200 feet long, more than 100 feet wide, and about 40 feet deep. And again, inside that pool, as the listener noted, and as I've kind of referenced, there's a full-scale replica of parts of the International Space Station in it, so including trusses and modules and handrails. So basically a submerged ISS that's used for astronaut training. Just incredible. And the listener is absolutely right that scuba diving and zero gravity don't seem to have much in common. So water has drag, it has pressure. You can feel resistance when you move, and space doesn't have any of that. But the key concept of why the Neutral Buoyancy Lab is used for astronaut training is actually in the NBL's name, and that's neutral buoyancy. So at the NBL, engineers work with astronauts to carefully add weights and flotation to the astronauts' suits, to their EVA suit or spacewalk suit. So when they're underwater, they neither sink nor float. They hover. And that condition, called neutral buoyancy, removes the feeling of weight pulling you down or the astronaut floating to the surface, which allows astronauts to train through positions and movements that are associated with hovering and that feeling of weightlessness. And just a quick side note, astronauts in orbit are actually free of gravity. They're in continuous free fall around Earth. That's what creates that sensation of weightlessness. So the underwater setup in the NBL doesn't need to eliminate gravity per se, it just needs to eliminate that feeling of weight or create weightlessness. So, as noted, the MBL isn't about perfectly copying physics. It's about creating an environment to practice the work that astronauts are going to be doing outside of the space station during a spacewalk, or what we call extravehicular activity, or EVA. And spacewalks are choreographed absolutely down to the minute. When you watch them going, the astronauts going through their spacewalks, all that's been practiced time and time again. They typically last 6 to 8 hours, and astronauts have to move along handrails, manage tethers, use specialized tools, swap out hardware, and also troubleshoot unexpected problems. And all this is while wearing a pressurized suit that's bulky and stiff and really exhausting for the astronaut to operate. So when they're underwater in the NBL, the astronauts go through and practice every single movement to optimize their movements, their handholds, the timing, and really create muscle memory across their workload. So they're rehearsing how to position their bodies, how to stabilize themselves without pushing off uncontrollably, how to turn bolts with a thick pressurized glove, and even to avoid twisting their tether lines. And so the training sessions themselves are really intense for the astronauts, but they also allow for practicing other operational requirements like communication. So during these practice NBL runs, there's a full mission control team running the simulation. There are divers in the pool that act as safety backups. Communications are rehearsed exactly as they would be in orbit. And so when you look at an EVA, every single spacewalk, each of those spacewalks is practiced over and over and over again underwater before anyone ever leaves the airlock in space. And so as noted, water can't simulate everything. There's no vacuum, there's no radiation. You don't get the big temperature swings that you get in space. And it doesn't perfectly replicate inertia because in space, once something massive starts moving, it really keeps moving in a very different way. But NASA uses other platforms and other forms of training to capture some of those other aspects of spacewalk performance and physiology. But when it comes to learning how to physically do a spacewalk, so that the actual actions and motions themselves, how to move, work, manage tools, conserve energy, and follow through procedures and communication, the MBL is the best large-scale simulation that we have on Earth.
Great answer, Don. And for our listener, it's not a contiguous replica of space station. In other words, you don't visualize a giant pool with the entire space station sitting in it, though it is giant. As Don said, it's sort of modules and parts, and all the relevant parts are there where the astronaut would be interacting as she was describing. But, you don't have these long trusses or solar panels. It's just the parts they need to use to train.
Correct. Yep. Thank you for that visual clarification, Ken. So Ken, now we've got some questions for you. So a listener asks if Ken remains optimistic about the utility of supplementation with urolithin-A, and she notes that it's been discussed several times on STEM Talk, but it's quite expensive. So she's wondering if there are new research findings, and also if Ken has a favorite brand that he can suggest.
Well, yes, I do remain optimistic about the potential utility of urolithin-A. It's been a recurring topic on STEM Talk, as our longtime listeners will recall, and that's because the science continues to build in promising ways, particularly around mitochondrial health, muscle function, and more recently, immune support. In episode 118, we chatted with Julie Anderson at the Buck Institute, and she talked about urolithin-A's potential to prevent and treat neurodegenerative diseases. And in episode 173, we had Anurag Singh on the show, and he talked about urolithin-A's ability to optimize mitochondrial efficiency. And Anurag Singh is also an author on the paper that we're about to discuss. This paper, it's really the most recent standout paper in my view, is from the fall of 2025. So it's very recent. It appeared in Nature Aging. And the title of the paper is Effective Mitophagy Inducer Urolithin-A on Age-Related Immune Decline, a randomized placebo-controlled trial. This paper reports a quite solid proof-of-concept study. So it's only a proof-of-concept study, has 50 healthy middle-aged to older than middle-aged. Roughly their cohort group was 45 years old to 70 years old. They took either 1,000 milligrams of urolithin-A each day or a placebo, and they only did this for 4 weeks. So it was a relatively short, relatively strong dose. Interesting. The bottom line is that the short course of urolithin-A appeared to safely rejuvenate several key aspects of immune system health in middle-aged adults, essentially shifting immune cell populations, metabolism, and function toward a more youthful pattern. Now, it's still very early, and it's a relatively small proof-of-concept study, so there aren't long-term data or clinical outcomes like infection rates for this application, that is, for immune support. But it clearly builds on earlier work showing that urolithin-A does improve muscle and mitochondrial health, and now it's giving us the first clear human evidence that it can meaningfully target immunosenescence and inflammaging as well. So yes, it is exciting, and it's a nice direction for this work. Now, as for a favorite brand, the one most consistently used in the clinical research is the natural one to recommend, I think, and it's called Mitopure by Timeline. It's the form, as I said, that's really been used in pretty much all human trials that have shown benefits. On the cost side, yes, it's relatively expensive for a relevant dose, and that's thought to be 500 to 1,000 milligrams a day, somewhere in that range. This study, as I mentioned, used 1,000 milligrams a day, but it was very brief. So I am excited about urolithin-A, and I look forward to more research.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Ken. So another listener submitted a question about rapamycin and cardiac function based on having seen a 2025 paper published in Geroscience by Moody and colleagues from Mayo Clinic. And that paper was titled Short-Term mTOR Inhibition by Rapamycin Improves Cardiac and Endothelial Function in Older Men, a proof-of-concept pilot study.
Yes, that study also got my attention. I read it when it first came out, as the reader said, in 2025. I think I'll provide sort of an updated summary of the current evidence for mTOR inhibition via rapamycin as a potential therapy targeting cardiac and endothelial function in the older population, frankly. So, multiple independent labs have consistently shown that rapamycin and rapalogs reverse age-related diastolic dysfunction in aged mice, even when started late in life. And in some models, the benefits to heart function persisted well after cessation of treatment. Similar improvements in diastolic and systolic parameters have been observed in middle-aged dogs as well. Our intrepid listener, however, asked about the 2025 pilot study by Moody et al. This pilot study looked at a very small cohort of 6 relatively healthy older men aged 70 to 76 years of age. So it's a human study. Their paper reported that low-dose rapamycin, and it was very low dose, it was 1 milligram a day for 8 weeks, was safe and significantly improved key markers of age-related cardiovascular decline. In particular, they saw significant improvements in diastolic parameters. For example, things like peak left ventricular filling rate, blood acceleration, and transmitral flow volume all improved in every subject. Again, there were only 6 of them. Systolic function really showed minimal changes, however. They also observed statistically significant improvement in nitric oxide-mediated vasodilation. Grip strength, interestingly, also increased, but they saw no changes in walking speed or inflammatory markers, though there were some trends suggesting possible benefits, but not statistically significant. Remember, these were healthy, or at least relatively healthy, older men without heart disease. And it's a small, open-label, non-placebo-controlled study. The results should be interpreted as hypotheses generating rather than definitive. However, these are promising results, and they are in humans, so it clearly called for further investigation. So now we have another larger ongoing trial at Mayo Clinic called Effect of Rapamycin to Improve Cardiac Function in Frail Older Adults with Heart Failure and Preserved Ejection Fraction. This is testing rapamycin then in actual heart failure patients. As of now, no results have been published, so the outcomes remain pending. So, what's the bottom line? The chain of evidence here remains promising. Preclinical reversal in animal models is robust and reproducible, and the 2025 human pilot provides encouraging translational support in older adults. If the ongoing Mayo Clinic trial shows even modest benefits on key endpoints, low-dose rapamycin could indeed be considered an important disease-modifying therapy targeting heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. And this is a condition with really limited treatment options beyond simple symptom management, and some metabolic therapies. We'll know more once these patient data emerge. I hope that happens soon. So this is an interesting emerging topic and one that people are paying close attention to.
Thanks, Ken, for that answer. So we've got another question about a paper. So a listener asks Ken about a 2020 paper from a research group at Yale, which suggests that mTOR activation may not be necessary for ketamine's beneficial effects in the context of depression, and that mTOR suppression via rapamycin might actually prolong ketamine's antidepressant effects. Ken, do you have thoughts around that?
Oh, yes. This paper, when it first came out in 2020, lit up my inbox. And so I do remember this paper well and how surprising it was in a way. And so let's discuss that and some subsequent work as well. First of all, this paper that we're discussing, the 2020 paper from Yale, is best understood as a carefully executed, methodologically fragile, in my view, pilot that has been overinterpreted in its narrative implications in many respects, but particularly with respect to the durability of the antidepressant response and the mechanistic inference from that. The original intent of this study was quite straightforward and scientifically reasonable. It was to test whether ketamine's antidepressant effects in humans depend on mTOR activation by administering rapamycin prior to ketamine infusion. And as is well known, rapamycin strongly suppresses mTOR activation. However, rapamycin did not blunt ketamine's 24-hour antidepressant effect. And this weakens the strong claim that many have made that mTOR activation is strictly required for ketamine's acute efficacy. So that was an interesting finding by itself. One would have expected rapamycin to blunt the effects of ketamine. Subsequent emphasis then shifted to an unanticipated secondary signal, suggesting that rapamycin might prolong ketamine's antidepressant effects. That signal became the conceptual centerpiece of the paper. The problem is not whether the signal exists. It does, but that the study design and sample size make it unusually fragile. There are only 20 patients in the study, and the finding of increased durability at 2 weeks rests on very small absolute numbers of responders. This study shows rapamycin does not abolish ketamine's acute antidepressant effects and raises a plausible but unproven hypotheses about durability modulation. This should be treated as an intriguing pilot study that warrants replication in a cleaner, adequately powered, parallel group design, but not as a result that justifies strong mechanistic or clinical conclusions on its own. Interestingly, the same investigative group at Yale has not published a definitive larger-scale clinical replication confirming the durability signal. Subsequent publications from this group have relied on secondary analyses of the original 20-patient cohort, which did not demonstrate a rapamycin-related enhancement of durability. In addition, a larger parallel group randomized study conducted by an independent group with approximately 48 participants was later reported in abstract form in the International Journal of Neuropsychopharmacology in 2025. That study did not show a significant benefit of rapamycin in prolonging ketamine's antidepressant effects. So, taken together, these latter results further support interpreting the original durability finding in the 2020 paper as hypotheses generating rather than confirmatory.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research organization investigating a broad range of topics aimed at understanding and extending human cognition, locomotion, health span, resilience, and performance.
So, Ken, this is a little bit of a shift in topic, but we received a question from a scientist who formerly worked in Antarctica about Russia's dominance in the realm of icebreakers. And this is especially when compared to the US. So he'd love to get your thoughts in that space.
Oh, yes. Well, this is an interesting and multifaceted question, and I'll take this in a couple parts. But although the Arctic region is of increasing importance, the U.S. focus for icebreakers has really always been in support of its facilities in Antarctica. So I'll take that part of the story first. So first, let me say that I too have been to the various U.S. facilities in Antarctica while I was serving on the National Science Board. The National Science Foundation runs the U.S. Antarctic program, and every year it must resupply, obviously, through McMurdo Station. The ice-breaking effort has been accomplished by the United States Coast Guard. As the listener may recall, the winter of 2004 and 2005 was logistically very difficult for the supply of the extensive U.S. science facilities in Antarctica, and it revealed deep vulnerabilities in the U.S. icebreaking fleet. The Antarctic resupply mission depends on a heavy icebreaker to cut a channel through 60 to 90 miles of sea ice into McMurdo Sound, allowing fuel and cargo ships to reach the station. This station is the logistics hub for the entire U.S. Antarctic program. That year, the Ross Sea experienced the thickest and most extensive sea ice in many decades, in some places well over 10 feet thick. The Coast Guard has only one functional heavy icebreaker. It's called the Polar Star, and it's now roughly 50 years old, far past her original 30-year design life. The Polar Star struggled mightily to open the channel, and the crew worked around the clock. The conditions were so severe that the NSF began searching urgently for a backup. Russia's icebreaker Krasin had been used in the 2002 to 2003 winter. But by 2004, the agency wanted a more modern and preferably a Western flag vessel. The U.S. formally chartered the heavy icebreaker Odin under a contract with the Swedish Maritime Administration, and the costs naturally were borne by the National Science Foundation. The Polar Star and Odin began working together, breaking through the 90 miles of ice I mentioned, clearing a path to McMurdo. They succeeded, but only after weeks of 24-hour operations, multiple setbacks, lots of strain and damage to the systems, and strain on the crew. In January 2005, the resupply ships finally reached McMurdo safely. The 2004 and 2005 winters exposed the fragility of the U.S. polar logistics and really catalyzed renewed calls in Congress and from the Coast Guard for icebreaker fleet renewal. These discussions eventually evolved into a program known as the Polar Security Cutter Program. So these dramatic events took place some 20 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago. A reasonable person might ask if matters had improved over 20 years. The short answer is no. But with the Polar Security Cutter Program, there is some relief on the way. The plan is to produce at least 6 polar-capable vessels, with 3 being heavy icebreakers and 3 being medium icebreakers. The first ship will likely be delivered in the 2030 timeframe, with operational status coming later. So, as of now, the United States is in the rather ridiculous position of having only one heavy icebreaker, the 50-year-old Polar Star, and 2 old medium icebreakers. Russia operates by far the world's largest fleet of approximately 41 icebreakers. The fleet strength lies in its 8 nuclear-powered heavy icebreakers, and there are more in development as of now. These nuclear-powered heavy icebreakers are critical for maintaining the northern sea route and enabling Arctic resource development for Russia. The United States isn't using nuclear power in its new icebreakers because the Coast Guard's missions, its budget, and frankly its infrastructure don't justify it, at least not yet. That said, there is growing United States interest in small modular reactors for future military and perhaps Arctic support use. The United States, Canada, and Finland have formed the Ice Pact to enhance collaboration on icebreaker construction, aiming to counter Russia's dominance. Though progress is hindered, of course, by budget constraints and, frankly, by industrial capacity issues. So, the long and the short of it is, we expect improvement soon, and to stay tuned. And by the way, if one has the opportunity to visit Antarctica, you should do it.
Yeah, I'm jealous that you've been, and that is definitely on the top of my list. So, yeah, that's a really great answer, Ken. So this is another kind of redirect on topics, but given your broad scope of knowledge and experience, I think this is definitely one that, it would be great to get your take on. A listener asked about their experience with ChatGPT, in which it denied that Charlie Kirk had been assassinated weeks after the event occurred, and wanted to know how and why this happened. And also, what are the implications, if any, for the potential applications of LLMs as we move forward?
Yes, that is an interesting question, and it is somewhat revealing, as the author of the question must have presupposed with respect to limitations. So I'll start with the ChatGPT experience that this listener had. Interestingly, he was not the only one, of course, who had this experience. Many people reported the same experience. And on October 11th, a month and a day after the shooting, this was the output from ChatGPT. Quote, there are no credible reports that Charlie Kirk, the U.S. political commentator and founder of Turning Point USA, has been killed or shot. He is alive, and any stories claiming otherwise are false, or part of a hoax, or a misinformation campaign circulating online. There is no verified incident, police report, or reputable news coverage of an assassin or shooting involving him. If you saw an image or a video suggesting such an event, it's almost certainly fabricated or AI generated. Isn't that rich? AI generated, and it's AI that's telling you that. In any case, ChatGPT's confident denial stemmed from a fundamental limitation of base models like the free version. And typically in ChatGPT, though I expect this will change soon, may have changed already, they lack real-time updating because it relies on training data that stops at a fixed point in time, often months or even a year behind. So when asked about new or breaking low-probability events, they tend to overcorrect and they default to denial to avoid spreading falsehoods. So these cutoff points are necessary. You can't keep training the model endlessly. So what happens is the model is frozen, and that's what it has access to. In the paid versions and some other large language model chatbots, when there's something like this, it also hits the open internet and checks there too. So that's how they get around it in many cases. But the LLM itself is essentially frozen at a point in time when they stop training. A similar case emerged in January of this year after U.S. forces captured Nicolas Maduro. As reported by Wired magazine, ChatGPT again insisted that the event didn't happen and that Maduro remained in power even after widespread coverage and an official announcement by President Trump. Cognitive scientist Gary Marcus noted that pure large language models are stuck in the past, reflecting lack of access to live data. And that's sort of what we just discussed. It's not a bug, it's how they're designed naturally. Newer systems, as I was mentioning, or paid versions typically integrate real-time search and retrieval generation, sometimes called RAG, to handle such events more smoothly. These are sort of hybrid systems that incorporate verified information as it emerges, narrowing the gap between stored knowledge in the model and emerging breaking news. Still, without robust grounding mechanisms, large language models can produce fluent and confident but factually wrong outputs, especially in fast-moving or politicized contexts. This makes them unreliable for many mission-critical domains, such as crisis response, military applications, or intelligence analysis, to name but a few. They do excel, however, at many stable tasks. For example, large language models are quite good at summarizing known information, drafting and analysis, working in worlds that are relatively stable. But for current events in a dynamic environment, they should be treated as assistive tools, not as sources of truth. Always corroborate their output with trusted current sources and human judgment. I have a friend who is an elderly physician, a well-known cardiologist, and the push to use large language models in cardiology was sort of confounding him. And while doing scientific research on wine quality, he asked me how he should think about this. And I explained to him that he should regard the best systems somewhat like a medical fellow. And he said, well, I've had many, many medical fellows in my long career. And he said they're bright and bushy-tailed and full of energy and often have poor judgment. I said, right. So when the AI system tells you something, you at best should consider it as if it came from a medical fellow. Could be right, could be wrong. It's an idea, it's a hypothesis, it's something for you to check out. It might stimulate thought that you would not had otherwise, but it should not be taken as truth from the mouth of God or something.
Yeah, they're still building their experience, right? And getting that background. So that makes perfect sense. Always keep the human in the loop. It's always important.
That's from my point of view, that's why you have the loop.
Well, that was a great answer, Ken. So we're going to shift back a little bit towards health. So several listeners have asked about a paper that was published in Nature on August 6, 2025, and it was titled Lithium Deficiency and the Onset of Alzheimer's Disease. So they'd like to know your thoughts around this paper.
Well, in my view, this is a groundbreaking study conducted by Harvard Medical School researchers Bruce Yanker and first author Liviu Aron. And this paper, the results it reports reveals that naturally occurring lithium in the brain plays a crucial protective role against Alzheimer's disease. Analyzing post-mortem brain tissue from donors across cognitive stages using advanced mass spectrometry on about 30 different metals, the team found lithium levels were significantly reduced as early as mild cognitive impairment, a precursor to Alzheimer's, with further declines in more advanced cases. Lithium was the only metal showing such early consistent changes. The authors proposed the amyloid beta plaques sequester lithium, limiting its bioavailability and thereby accelerating hallmark pathologies, such as the tau tangles, neural inflammation, synaptic and myelin damage, and of course memory loss. In mouse models, dietary lithium deficiency worsened Alzheimer's-like changes, such as increased plaques and tangles, inflamed microglia, neuronal damage, and cognitive deficits. Remarkably, supplementing with lithium orotate, an amyloid-evading form identified through a novel screening platform, restored physiological levels at very low doses, reversing much of this pathology, reduced inflammation, preserved synapses and myelin, and improved or rescued cognitive function, even in aged mice with well-established disease. This suggests lithium deficiency may be an early trigger, amplifying toxic processes, potentially explaining why some individuals with significant amyloid buildup never progress to dementia, thanks to higher natural lithium offering greater protection. These findings also align with prior epidemiological evidence, such as studies linking higher trace lithium in drinking water to lower dementia rates in those populations. Looking ahead, this opens exciting possibilities in my view. Creating a reliable diagnostic blood test for lithium deficiency, potentially integrated into routine checkups, could one day serve as a biomarker for early Alzheimer's risk, perhaps enabling preventive interventions. So, while highly promising, the results are clearly preclinical. Human clinical trials, which are planned in the near future, are essential to confirm both safety and efficacy. But yes, this is an interesting paper for sure.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
I never would have thought of it.
Nope, not at all. A lot of, like you said, the implications are fascinating as well. So.
It is. That's one of those papers that sort of boggles, you read it 3 times, and you think, wow.
Yeah.
If this pans out, this is interesting.
Yeah, and incredibly impactful.
And it's interesting that the orotate form, evades the capture.
The mechanism behind that is interesting. So, Ken, we have one more question for you for today's Ask Me Anything. So, a listener writes, please ask Dr. Ford about his thoughts regarding what has sometimes been called the arginine paradox. So, it's well known that the body uses L-arginine to make nitric oxide, a molecule that helps blood vessels relax and stay flexible. So, you'd think that taking arginine would reliably help aging blood vessels. However, in 2025, I've seen papers reporting that L-citrulline supplementation may be more effective in this role. I would appreciate any insights regarding the possible effects of citrulline in vascular health and aging more broadly.
Yes, well, buckle up. So that is a very interesting question and something I have been pondering myself. So I will start first by discussing an important 2018 paper, and then we'll discuss 3 2025 papers that sort of build on the 2018 paper. And then we will discuss a final 2025 paper that examines citrulline in the context of aging more broadly. So the 2018 paper I mentioned was published in PLOS One by Tsutobi, Maeda, and Hayashi. It helps explain this apparent paradox. That is, why does oral consumption of L-arginine not necessarily translate into stronger nitric oxide-related effects? One would think it would. The authors exposed vascular endothelial cells to high glucose to model diabetes-like metabolic stress. So under these conditions, the cells showed higher oxidative stress, of course, and increased markers associated with cellular senescence and DNA damage. In their high glucose endothelial stress model, L-citrulline, either alone or combined with L-arginine, performed better than L-arginine alone. Citrulline attenuated oxidative stress signaling and improved several indicators associated with endothelial cell aging. including reduced expression of P16, which is an important senescence marker, and restoration of telomerase activity, which supports telomere maintenance and cellular function. The paper also highlights a practical limitation of oral L-arginine supplementation. A substantial fraction of ingested arginine can be consumed during the first-pass metabolism, notably in the gut and liver, thereby limiting how much arginine actually reaches systemic circulation. This reduced bioavailability may help explain why oral arginine does not always produce consistent increases in nitric oxide and the related beneficial effects. So what's the takeaway from the 2018 paper? Well, it's that under metabolic stress, citrulline may support systemic arginine availability and downstream nitric oxide biology more reliably than arginine itself taken alone. More recently, in 2025, a cluster of related papers added more support, especially in humans. In a randomized controlled trial published in 2025 in the journal Nutrients, Kang et al. Reported that 4 weeks of L-citrulline, 6 grams a day, improved standard artery lining test called flow-mediated dilation and reduced leg arterial stiffness in adults with type 2 diabetes, with additional improvements in blood pressure and glucose measures. In another paper published in Nutrients, also in 2025 by the same team of researchers, Figueroa et al. Found that citrulline improved microvascular endothelial function and muscle microvascular reactivity, along with improved calf muscle strength, again in middle-aged and older adults with type 2 diabetes. The study also used a 6-gram dose of L-citrulline with 3 grams in the morning and 3 grams in the evening for 4 weeks. Just as an aside, the capsules were provided by Now Foods and taken 1 hour before or after meals to ensure consistent absorption. In 2025, there was also a systemic review, a meta-analysis paper in Frontiers in Nutrition by Luo, which concluded that citrulline supplementation significantly improved flow-mediated dilation overall. Effects on pulse wave velocity were more mixed, though, in the pooled analysis, though some subgroup results measured were favorable. So, what does this all point to? In summary, these 4 papers suggest that although arginine is the direct substrate for nitric oxide synthesis, vascular or metabolic stress can limit how well arginine is delivered or used for nitric oxide production. Citrulline, because the body converts it into arginine, often raises circulating arginine more reliably and therefore may support nitric oxide biology more consistently than arginine alone. This is especially true, it seems, in diabetes and in other age-related vascular stresses. Now, finally, a broader 2025 paper focused on the role of citrulline in aging, and it appeared in Science Advances by Shai et al. This paper reported that citrulline declines with age in mice across several tissues, including brain, liver, and serum. Supplementing older mice reduced senescence-related changes, also reduced DNA damage and cell cycle arrest, improved macrophage function, and lowered chronic inflammation. So this really improved multiple age-linked phenotypes that are associated with health span. Mechanistically, citrulline dampened mTOR HIF-1 alpha glycolysis signaling in inflammatory macrophages. This is a pathway implicated in aging and is targeted by drugs such as rapamycin. Boy, rapamycin has come up 3 times in this episode. Overall, this work suggests that age-related citrulline decline may contribute to inflammation and that supplementation does merit further study, especially in humans, because most of these results have been in mice. It seems that we say that a lot on STEM Talk. These results are fascinating, promising, hypotheses-generating, but in mice. And I really love to see studies in humans. I understand the need for the animal models, but it's great when you see it replicated in humans.
Yeah, that translation is important.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
So, Ken, it seems like STEM Talk must have the smartest listeners in all of podcast land.
Yes.
And there's a lot of recent curiosity about rapamycin as well, by the way.
There is. Rapamycin. We had 2 rapamycin questions, and it came up in an answer to a 3rd question.
Yep.
But yes, you're right. It certainly does seem to be the case that we do have the most curious and clever listeners around. And they ask terrific questions. Often in this episode, a lot of the questions were from very recent papers. You know, these were papers that had just come out right before Christmas, a lot of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really exciting. So this is Dawn Carnegie signing off for now.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye Until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.